It is now my pleasure to introduce our next panel, a potential breakthrough in the U.S.-Iran nuclear talks, an American perspective. This panel will be moderated by Dr. Colin Clark, Director of Research at the Soufan Group and Senior Research Fellow at the Soufan Center. He will be joined by Dr. Emma Ashford, Senior Fellow, Reimagining U.S. Grand Strategy Program at the Stimson Center. Mr. Matthew Duss, Executive Vice President at the Center for International Policy. Mr. Mark Pfeifle, founder of the Off the Record Strategies and former Deputy National Security Advisor for Strategic Communication and Global Outreach at the National Security Council. And Dr. Ben Conable, Executive Director, the Battle Research Group.
Thanks so much. Welcome to the 7th Annual Global Security Forum, and thank you very much to our generous hosts in this beautiful venue. As most of you probably know, a third round of talks between Iran and the US over Iran's nuclear program occurred last weekend. There's been talk of a potential breakthrough in negotiations that would have significant implications for regional security in the Middle East and global security more broadly. We're going to get into an American perspective on the consequences of a deal and what to expect next. We'll also talk about the implications of what happens if a deal falls apart. I'd like to start with Emma, and if you could help paint a picture for the audience and describe the various camps right now within the Trump administration. Is it hawks versus doves? Is it hardliners versus pragmatists? Is it something a bit more complicated?
Yeah, thanks so much, and thank you to everybody for being here today. I think to understand what's going on, we really do have to go back to the first Trump administration. And at that time, I think the Republican Party was a much more traditional Republican Party foreign policy. Lots of people who sort of tried to persuade President Trump, whose own instincts may have been in a different direction, but tried to persuade him to pursue a maximum pressure campaign against Iran, to withdraw from the JCPOA, and to pursue various other sort of pressure actions against Iran, promising that this would help him achieve a better deal. And I think, coming in this time around, Donald Trump himself was very wary, is very wary of that pressure because it didn't produce the results last time. What has changed? Because I think he would not have been able to pursue negotiations, again, despite his own inclinations, if something hadn't changed in the Republican Party. But what we have seen is a new constellation in Republican foreign policy. A lot of different groups, some of them very traditional, like the paleo-conservatives, who are much more dovish on foreign policy, but others who are genuine China hawks, who see Iran as somewhere that will get the US bogged down further in the Middle East and prevent us pivoting to China. I think the vice president falls into this camp. And so I think Trump now has internal support for an Iran deal in a way that he didn't before. And he wants to make a deal. That's clear. He wants to make a deal across a variety of contexts: Gaza, Ukraine, now the Iran issue. But he's still under pressure from some of these more traditional, more anti-Iran hawks in and around the administration, in particular outside the administration in DC, who I think are still trying to pressure him towards the military option, but also pushing hard on things like enrichment or missiles that might actually make it harder to get to a deal by putting that front and center in Trump's mind.
Thank you. I want to turn to Ben next. President Trump pulled the U.S. out of the JCPOA primarily because of the agreement did not stem Iranian support to regional terrorism. We're talking about non-state actors. We're talking a lot about violent non-state actors. Are we likely to see the inclusion of those stipulations in a new deal? And if so, are those even enforceable?
Right, that was the original justification. And of course, the landscape has changed significantly in that Iran is now much weaker than it was when Trump pulled out of the JCPOA. Hezbollah has been basically dismantled. Hamas is certainly on its back feet. And then we're directly attacking the Houthis. So that Shia, the so-called Shia crescent or the Iranian crescent, whatever kind of term you want to use for that, is not what it was, and so maybe the concerns are not the same. I would disagree with that, and first of all, I don't, to answer your question directly, no, I don't think they're going to be able to put that into a deal in any meaningful way. If they are able to slip that in there, I think it would be in words only, and I don't see how it would in any way be enforceable. And what I mean by that is that the U.S. government would not be able to hold Iranian, like let's say the IRGC, Quds Force. I wouldn't think they would be able to use a treaty vehicle to stop them from influencing activities in Iraq or Syria or in Yemen. So while there is certainly constituencies, as Emma points out, within the administration that would want to see that, I don't think, first of all, it's that there's patience in the process to fit that into this timeline. And I get the feeling, so this is the American perspective, right? I'm not sure that we have an American perspective now in any collective sense of the word. So this is all of our interpretations of what that perspective would be. I think the timeline is as fast as possible. And if that's the intent, then this seems like the extremist groups, the network of influence, what we would call malign influence, falls by the wayside.
I tend to agree with you, and I've written about this, and personally I don't see it being a part of this deal, and I wonder if there are elements within the administration that try to play the role of spoiler because of that. I want to turn to Matt next to see if you would speak about Trump's diplomacy happening inside and a trap set by hawks, some of the kind of maximalist demands and the so-called Libya model that has come up. What is that, and why is that important?
Right. Yeah, first, just again, want to thank the forum for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be here. So yeah, I mean, I think I agree largely with Emma's description of some of the factions within the administration and within the broader Washington foreign policy conversation. And I think with some of the more hawkish elements, whatever term we want to use, the kind of traditional Republican foreign policy establishment, the neoconservatives, whatever, this is something that you've seen introduced. Senator Tom Cotton brought this up in a hearing a couple weeks ago, the Libya model. It's no accident that we've also seen Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu using this exact same term. I mean, these factions are they have a deep relationship, and I think they share some of this same strategic outlook. And the reason they bring up the Libya model, which is to say complete surrender of Iran's nuclear program, is because they know it is something that Iran will never agree to, and that is the whole point. This is a faction that opposes any deal with Iran, regardless of what the details of that deal are. And so I think there are others in the administration who understand that, certainly others in Washington, that it has nothing to do with the actual contents of the deal. They just oppose making agreements with Iran. But I think what's also been revealed over the past few years as Trump has steadily asserted control over the party and empowered some of these different elements of the foreign policy voices in the party and in Washington, is that the more hawkish elements actually don't speak for a very large constituency of voters. There's strong support amongst the so-called restrainers and the prioritizers within the administration. Prioritizers want to focus on China, as Emma said. They see the Middle East and Iran and the conflict with Iran in many ways as a distraction. They want to divest from the amount of attention and resources that has been paid to the Iran problem, and they now see an agreement, even one that could potentially be very similar in scope to the JCPOA, one that limits Iran's nuclear program, puts it under strict surveillance, keeps Iran about a year away from any potential nuclear weapon. As that's a workable deal. And I'll say, as someone who comes more from the progressive left side of the political spectrum, and I see Trump doing quite a bit of damage both in domestic and foreign policy terms, this is a policy I agree with. And I think if Trump can actually get a deal, he's not only going to have support within his own party, I think he's going to have considerable support among Democrats, although they will, of course, wait to see what the agreement actually entails.
Thank you for that. And I do want to, at some point, get into what this means vis-a-vis China and the long-awaited pivot to Asia that I've heard about. So you referenced some folks in the current administration that that actually don't want a deal. Mark, I want to ask you, does Iran really want a deal, or is Tehran running out the clock here?
So I try to put myself into the mind of working in the White House again. My blood pressure went up about 20 points. A lot of my hair started falling out, and I picked up the New York Times this morning, and it said that Iran is cautiously optimistic. Now, I've written cautiously optimistic a dozen or so times. What it usually means, Colin, is we've got some of our best people working on it, and we haven't the foggiest idea how this is going to turn out. So, but at least what we know is that Iran does have a lot of leverage. The White House has leverage over Iran right now. They have sanctions, which are hurting them, of course, financially. They have ongoing attacks on their various proxies, such as the Houthis, the Hezbollah, and Hamas. So that's ongoing as well. And then it's timing. So Trump said 60 days. The clock is ticking. It might go a little bit further. There just happened to be a New York Times story that came out that said that Israel has an attack plan, and it involves using Israeli commandos and U.S. aircraft. So that means that Trump, if he's not willing to come up with a deal, and the Iranians are not, there could be ground troops from Israel and sophisticated U.S. aircraft going in deep into Iran. Does Iran want that? Is to be seen. Then we know that it's focus, what it comes down to. Steve Witkoff, the envoy to the Middle East, is very busy these days. He's negotiating with Vladimir Putin, he's negotiating Hamas and Israel, and now he's added this third little issue to his portfolio. He's trying to find a nuclear deal with the Iranians, so it comes down to focus as well. Here's the reality of what it comes down to. Does the Iranian leadership really want a deal, or are they merely running out the clock? And does Donald Trump, the president, really want to use U.S. aircraft deep into Iran to really take out a number of sites, as it would have to do to make a significant impact? And does that continue another forever war, such as Matt was talking about, that many people are against across the political spectrum, and that he ran against in his election? Those are the two realities that we're trying to figure out.
I want to follow up a little bit on your last point, and I wonder, is there pressure building within the Trump administration for an attack against Iran because there's this perception? Well, I guess I would start with, do you agree that Iran is at a weak point? And if so, how does that alter the calculation here after the last, 16, 17 months of conflict in the region?
So it has weakened them a great deal. It's taken out a
And
lot
the
of their
proxies,
financial capability.
obviously.
It's taken out their proxies. Mr. Assad fleeing from Syria, heading on a Russian plane to somewhere deep within Russia, that has had an impact on them. Whether it's enough to change the leadership of Mr. Khamenei and his clerics to actually want to do something or not, that's the unknown factor. And really, we don't know the answer to that. Only they know that right now.
I want to turn back to Emma, and I'm wondering if you can help us highlight some of the notable differences in attitudes. We're here in the Gulf about conflict with Iran or a potential deal. How has that changed since the first Trump administration to where we are now?
That's a great question. And I really do think this is something that is beginning to be appreciated in Washington, but perhaps not fully understood yet. Again, if we go back to the first Trump administration, we see not just Tel Aviv encouraging Donald Trump to go in really hard on Iran, but we also see leadership in Riyadh, in the United Arab Emirates, in other parts of the Arab world, encouraging Trump to, again, pursue maximum pressure with Iran, to dial up the tension. And something that I think has really really changed is, we do now see a move towards much more reassurance in the Gulf between Iran and the Gulf states, attempts to rebuild ties between the Saudis and the Iranians, the Emiratis and the Iranians, that we didn't see the last time around. And so, this time, part of the difference is that when Donald Trump comes here in 2 weeks, he will probably, from most of his interlocutors here, he will hear, that they are keen for diplomacy to go forward. And that's a very different place to be in. A bit like Trump this time has, domestic political support if he decides not to go forward with military action against Iran. I think he also has a level of international support, particularly in the region, that he did not have before. And so none of this means that the administration is going to be able to get to a deal, but I think it does reduce the pressure on Trump and on folks like Witkoff to, sort of offer a deal that is completely unacceptable in Tehran as a take it or leave it, right? I think it does increase the chance that we get to some kind of deal, and even if we don't, I think it probably does decrease the chance that we end up in a military conflict.
Matt, what are your thoughts on that same topic in terms of de-escalation and how folks in this part of the world are looking at that?
Yeah, I do see that change that Emma talked about on the part of a lot of Arab leaders, unfortunately not on the part of Israeli leaders. I think you do have elements of the Israeli security echelon who supported the JCPOA, because they understand that ultimately this is a good, effective way to cap Iran's nuclear program, to put it under control, to put limits on it. For people like Netanyahu, and I think part of his more right-wing political faction, again, they see Iran not only as a strategic threat, but also as a very useful political tool for promoting political fear, on which I think they clearly thrive. But they are at a bit of a disadvantage, because one of their strongest allies in terms of making that case in Washington, the Saudis, have taken a different position. Now you have the Saudi-Iran détente that took place a few years ago. You've had visits to Tehran by Saudi officials to talk about a possible interim deal. And frankly, I think that's very positive. Iran clearly, and its allies and its partners have been a source of instability. And I think dealing with Iran's nuclear program, while it would not magically solve a whole range of other problems, it would possibly create an area of trust that could then create opportunities to talk about some of those other areas of tension.
We're talking a lot about the implications of a possible deal. What could go right? Give us a picture, be a pessimist for a minute, and tell us what could go wrong and what are the consequences of that.
I don't know if I can be as good a pessimist as Ryan Crocker, but that was terrific. Look, I'm not anywhere near as optimistic here, because I think that this doesn't look like a traditional negotiation to me in any sense of the word as I understand negotiation. We are trying to pressure a deal on a narrow subject that I'm not sure they're fully incentivized, and I'm not sure we have an outcome in mind. I think we have an output in mind. And we're talking about all these nuances and all the different actors involved here, to include, by the way, Russia, which offered to, if I'm not mistaken, offered to take some of the uranium, and then, this is pretty cynical stuff, but to serve as guarantor to Iranian behavior. So all of these things balanced together. In an ideal world, then Witkoff would be the right guy for that job. I don't think there's anybody at least in my world, that thinks that he is the right guy to try to stitch all of these extraordinarily complex things together. So where could it go wrong? I think it can go wrong, first of all, if we wind up with what was just described, and it fails and we move towards a military operation. And I think there's a decent likelihood of that outcome. I don't think that ends well. I think one of the things that we've kind of been skipping over here is that we are at war. The United States is at war with the Houthi regime at the moment. And that is not a declared war, and I think a lot of Americans are not even really aware or conscious of the fact that we're at war with the Houthi regime. In every sense of the word. We said we're going to completely annihilate them, put aside the redundancy in that phrase. That is an outcome that is very warlike. We're bombing them every day. I think we're up to 800 strikes or something like that. And again, all output metrics, none of it focused on any kind of outcome. I'm not sure, frankly, that the Iranians are completely averse to having that happen. And I think there probably are parts of this is speculation, there are probably parts of the Iranian regime that would welcome an attack of that kind because they are in dire straits, and this would give them an opportunity to recenter and revitalize their internal support. And by the way, they've been preparing for this for quite some time. My guess is that the things that we would be hitting are probably far more resilient than we believe them to be. And any troops on the ground in Iran, we can have a separate conversation about that one, but boy, I think that's a high-risk activity. And Iran is 3 times the size of Iraq, and if you look at our operations in Iraq, maybe use that as a note of caution.
I kind of shuddered at the Russian guarantee there. I remember how that worked with chemical weapons in Syria, actually. Mark, I wanted to ask, we mentioned Witkoff's expanding portfolio, which, kind of makes my head spin some days, even just following his globetrotting. Does the U.S. more broadly have the attention span to see this through? Think about all the things that are going on right now: Ukraine, Gaza, tariffs, the border. Take your pick. This is a pretty big deal, and so are we in it?
So I think if there is one thing about this White House is it operates on Donald Trump time. So he is running this staff ridiculously fast. And from the executive orders to his various negotiations, some of these things are left over from the previous administration: Ukraine, Gaza, those types of things. And one would argue the border as well, as the porous border has been some level of border incursions are down. Then you have the things that he started, such as the tariff war, which is something that he completely started, and specifically with China and other countries. Now that's a full-time job as well. So you put all these things together, and then you have a U.S. and a world economy which is kind of on edge right now, with higher inflation, unemployment, unease in the markets. You put all of this together, and it means that the Iranian portfolio of trying to get a deal is very difficult to fit that in. And Mr. Trump tends to go from kind of shiny thing to shiny thing. Very transactional.
Oh, you've noticed.
Wants to get things done. But at the same time, he easily would move from Gaza to Ukraine and Russia and then to Iran and leave the other one on the back burner for a considerable time. So it's really a lack of focus in this White House, or in many White Houses, but specifically this White House, that can make a deal quite difficult in the next 2 months or so.
One of the things that strikes me about this discussion so far is how difficult it is to separate non-state actors from state actors, right? We're spending a lot of time talking about state actors. They're inextricably linked. I think, understandably, during the global war on terrorism, there was this, in my opinion, very narrow focus on violent non-state actors and a particular subset. The pendulum swung back in the other direction. Everybody talks about great power competition, China, Russia, et cetera. But I think we're entering a phase where it becomes a lot more difficult to disaggregate. That said, I do want to ask Emma about China because I've long believed, look, I study terrorism. That's what interests me, but I don't see it as an existential threat. I do think China is a pacing threat for the United States. What about this deal? Where does China fit into this deal, I guess is what I should say.
I mean, I do think again, I know I'm basically every answer contrasting the first time around with this time around, but I think you do have to understand that there is some coherence to the way this administration is actually going about foreign policy this time. Not necessarily on the tariff front, but on the diplomacy side of things, Steve Witkoff's ever-expanding portfolio, a lot of those are geared at putting the United States in a place where it can turn to focus more on Asia, on the Indo-Pacific. So whether that is, ending the war in Ukraine and trying to stop the sort of continued expenditure of munitions in that conflict that we might need in Asia, or whether that's, this nuclear diplomacy with Iran, I do think it is part of a more coherent strategy, maybe not emanating from the top man himself, right? But there are plenty of people around him, folks at DOD, folks in the Vice President's office now who are, again, keen to see maybe not a very, very aggressive forward-leaning posture against China, but who think that the last administration really neglected the region, that more should be done to build up connections with India, with other parties in the region, and who basically see what I think is a very accurate view, which is that we are pretty much just ignoring developments in the Indo-Pacific while all of this other stuff is going on. I do want to just say one thing on sort of Mark's comment, again, about Witkoff and his ever-expanding portfolio. I do think, Ukraine, right? There's a very clear case to be made, I think, that the administration is going to walk away from those negotiations at some point. They've even said as much. The Secretary of State came out the other day and said, if we don't see movement from the Ukrainians, we're just going to drop it. I think the Iran case might be slightly different, and that's for a couple of reasons. I mean, one is this pressure to go the military route if you can't get a deal, and the other is the fact that all of this negotiation has already been done. Right, 5 years ago. We went through all the issues. Things have changed. Iran is closer to a bomb, but the fundamental facts of the case haven't changed substantially, right? We're still arguing over, will they be allowed domestic enrichment? To what level? Who will be the guarantor? Where will the uranium go? These are the issues that got hashed out the first time around with the JCPOA. And so, I am not expecting a deal inside 60 days, but especially now the administration has appointed Michael Anton to go in and lead more technical talks alongside Witkoff. I actually think we could potentially see some kind of interim deal in a fairly short timeline, if only because, most of the issues have been hashed out already.
That leads me to a question for Matt, which is, to what extent would an interim deal or proposal be about crisis management? Is it that simple, or is it far more complex?
No, I think it would be. It would just be to show that, listen, both sides are ready to deal seriously and create some political, diplomatic space to deal with the broader set of issues. But as Emma said, a lot of those issues, at least in theory, were dealt with, well, not in theory, in practice. We are in a different situation now. Iran is much closer to a weapon. The sunsets would have to be rewritten and extended. But I also think part of what Iran, I think, will be watching and has been watching is, can we trust what this administration agrees to? I think they had that question when President Biden took office in January 2021. President Biden campaigned on rejoining the Iran nuclear agreement. It was one of the clearest and most unequivocal commitments he made, and he failed to do that. He slow-walked. He made a decision, I think a really incorrect one, to slow-walk his rejoining the agreement to see if he could possibly get a better deal, even though they never said this out loud. It was clear they were doing this. It was clear to the Iranians that you cannot, unfortunately, trust this new president. That is what they're trying to determine now, and I think they are savvy enough about American politics to see that Donald Trump does have control over his party. And that Democrats were, supportive of Obama's deal. They were strongly opposed to Trump withdrawing from the deal. And if enough Democrats could support such an agreement now, which I think they could, I think that could be something that helps, Iran to deal in good faith.
For Ben, I want you to try to help us unpack, if there is some kind of a deal, what does this mean for the states where Iran remains heavily invested, including Yemen, including Iraq, and perhaps Syria? Are we likely to see any substantive changes in Iran's posture?
I think the last part of the question is really important, because as I was listening here, I was wondering what about Iran's kind of state motivations have fundamentally changed since the JCPOA was signed. It certainly is in a weaker position in these proxy states, but I don't see any fundamental change to Iranian foreign policy objectives, the way that it interacts with its neighbors, other than some kind of prima facie, obviously, diplomatic engagements. I don't think either side has any reason to trust the other, and I don't see any, even if there is a deal signed, I don't see anything fruitful coming out of it other than a delay in perhaps what might be the inevitable violence to follow. So Iran obviously is deeply enmeshed in Iraq. However, I think there are far too many people in the foreign policy establishment in the United States who see Iraq as an Iranian proxy, and that absolutely is not the case. And I can tell you that I spent a lot of time working in and around Iraq and Iraqis, and particularly with the Iraqi leadership. They see themselves as independent. Is there Iranian influence in Iraq? Yes, there is. But I don't see that strengthening anytime soon, and I don't see a deal altering that, frankly. In terms of the Houthis, I don't see how that would be there would be any mechanism to enforce a change in the relationship between Iran and the Houthi state. If anything, the war that we're in with the Houthis right now is probably strengthening that relationship considerably. And by the way, the Iranians are probably well aware of the fact that we have dwindling stocks of conventional munitions. And so every bomb that we drop, every precision-guided munition we drop in Yemen is one that cannot be dropped in Iran, which, by the way, would be a much more complex and challenging military problem. So opening the door back into Syria, and I think that's one of the biggest things we have to worry about with Iran. If this really is a mechanism to give the Iranians space from their perspective, and it diverts our attention, then I think we can just expect to see recalcitrance and revanchism, and that they're going to go right back to where they were, because again, I don't think that there has been a fundamental change in their kind of policy perceptions. So a gradual return to the status quo, or a spiral into violence, I think.
I think your remarks on the Houthis are particularly well taken. I've been tracking growing cooperation between the Houthis and other violent non-state actors in the region, including Al-Shabaab in Somalia, kind of AQAP, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, now rearing its head again. What's old is new in some ways in that part of the world. Iraq keeps coming up inevitably. So I wanted to ask Matt, in a different way, looking through a lens of, we talk all the time about lessons learned. I think our British friends have it down better. They say lessons observed. You could argue that we don't really learn our lessons. What are some lessons from the Iraq War that may loom large, and how does that impact the framing of this discussion?
Yeah, I mean, I think the simplest one is the idea that we can solve our problems militarily is perhaps a politically attractive, but a fantastical one. And I would add, as some of my colleagues have said up here, this would not be just a one-off strike. This would be a series of strikes, and it would require boots on the ground for an extended period of time to assure that the goal had been achieved of denuclearizing Iran. So I think people inside the administration really understand that, and that's really important. The second point I would make in terms of lessons learned is not just Iraq, but North Korea. I think walking away from the agreed framework, again, an agreement that was in many ways imperfect. Non-proliferation agreements are often imperfect, but I think one that we should have stayed in, as with the JCPOA. But I think some of the voices, we talked about the kind of constellation of voices inside the administration. One of the hardest of hardliners in the first administration was John Bolton. The fact that he is now personally on the outs with Donald Trump is frankly a good thing.
Speaking of the Libya model.
Speaking of the Libya model. And again, Bolton, one of the biggest advocates for withdrawing from the agreed framework. I think we'd be in a much better position now had we stayed in it. We can't know for sure. But again, I think just, if one of the goals of foreign policy is often choosing the least bad option, an imperfect diplomatic agreement that limits or forestalls, the worst outcome is often the best choice.
Mark, given your experience working in the White House and working closely, what lessons can you derive? Is there anything that's relevant to today that you see when you kind of sit and open up the newspaper and say, oh man, I'm watching this mistake happen in slow motion, or here's an opportunity that I wish the United States, regardless of party, would seize upon? Is there anything that informs the present?
I think avoiding the groupthink of a military action is going to solve things, as Matt talked about, is something that has to be avoided. And I think
that's a common theme that's coming up over and over.
A lesson that was learned, absolutely, Colin. And then I think it's going back and thinking about Iran over the last decade or so, and how we thought in about 2009 or 10 with the election, but with Mr. Mousavi coming close and possibly even winning that election, an actual vote counting election, and then the protests that happened after that. Then you add the Arab Spring. We were all part of that process as well, and wondering, will that bring down the Ayatollah and the regime? And none of that actually happened. So a lot of that is wishful thinking. So to continue to think, and a lot of people that are in the Iran lobby that say, the people of Iran, they're peaceful, they just want to bring about a better future for their children. We've been hearing that and saying that for 2 generations. And the Iranian regime has such a stronghold on its population, on its media, on its speech, that I think it's going to be very difficult, even though a lot of people are saying we might be able to get a change in Iran, to see that happen, at least in the foreseeable future. So we've got to be careful about some of the different constituencies that we listen to justify what we want in some instances, whether it's a military campaign of a great deal of boots on the ground and U.S. Treasury being spent, or other things like that. We've got to be very cognizant of that and very careful that we don't get involved in another forever war, as Donald Trump called them in his campaign, again in the Middle East.
I keep hearing this term, boots on the ground, which honestly makes me shudder a bit. Emma, are there elements within the Trump administration that actually think that that's a good deal and that that's a feasible option for the United States?
I would say that there are folks in and around the Trump administration who, if the Overton window permitted such an option, would be in favor of it. But that's not the same thing as saying that that is what these groups are advocating for right now. Again, I think to Mark's point, and some of Matt's, we have learned a lot of lessons from Iraq and Afghanistan, many of them to do with what the American public will tolerate in terms of overseas armed intervention. And even sort of many of the most hawkish people in and around the Trump administration are advocating, not for significant boots on the ground, regime change in Tehran. You don't really hear those terms. Instead, what you hear are things like targeted strikes, right? Working with the Israelis, mowing the grass, setting Iran's program back 6 months or a year, and then we have to keep doing that. And I think, again, in many ways, that is just the understanding that is formed among these folks, that even if what they would like to see is US-led regime change in Tehran, that is just something that is not on the table politically, whether in this administration or any administration right now.
Ben.
Yeah, so I agree. I don't think that's anybody's plan at the moment, although I'm sure those plans are written up somewhere. It's useful to keep in mind that the United States has 10, if you count the Marines, about 11 or 12 active duty divisions, which is probably, I don't know, a third as many as we had going into the Gulf War in 1991, maybe even less. So we don't have the physical capacity to put quote-unquote boots on the ground in Iran. I would disagree that we learned from Iraq or Afghanistan in any meaningful way. I think the president has a vague understanding that the American people don't want to be involved in another ground war, but we are involved in another forever war. That was one of his first actions within the first couple of months of his presidency, was to sink us into war with Yemen. So if you keep threatening to kill people with bombs, and you keep threatening to use violence as your primary means of engagement, of diplomatic engagement, which it seems to be our key leverage, eventually you're going to get, somebody's going to call your bluff, or you're going to wind up doing what we did in Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan, which was to fall back into one of these things accidentally. So it's one thing to look at what we, trying to read the minds of the people in the White House and the person at the top. It's another thing to think about the kind of transactional thinking, the lack of holism, the lack of outcome-based thinking, the lack of strategic planning, the decimation of some of the strategic kind of think tank centers within the U.S. government that might provide better advice, and to think about the chaos that's ensuing as we threaten people over and over again, and the likelihood of violence, I actually would argue, is increasing, even if everybody logically thinks that that's not the outcome we desire.
We've got just a couple of minutes left, and I'd like to try to end on a positive note, despite all the doom and gloom. So presumably a deal would help transform Iran's economic and political landscape by easing sanctions and potentially inviting foreign direct investment into the country, although that would take time. Matt, what could that do for Iran and the broader region? Can you give us some optimism here as we head into lunch?
Sure. I mean, yeah, and I think this is the fact that it could, help rebuild Iran's economy, but also create more jobs for Americans in terms of the number of planes that Donald Trump has talked about possibly selling to Iran. I mean, this is actually one of his complaints going back to 2015 about the agreement back then, was that he saw Europeans moving into Iran potentially faster than Americans were. He eventually landed in a different place on the JCPOA, but that is a criticism that he made. And of course, Donald Trump is always about making these kinds of deals. So I think it's safe to say that's very much on his mind. Now, the impact inside Iran, and I think, Mark brought up, the Green Movement of 2009, the Arab Spring demonstrations and protests and those movements. And I'm glad he did that, because I want to keep that in mind. I think a lot of members of Iranian civil society, a lot of pro-democracy Iranian groups, even though I think these voices are a bit more diffuse now, given the years of protests we've seen, the Woman Life Freedom Movement, a series of trade union protests in Iran. There is an element of Iranian civil society that has been consistent, that, they want an agreement to deal with the nuclear program, because anything that dials down tension between the United States and Iran is something that creates more civil space inside Iran that is possible for them to do their work. So again, I don't want to have any illusions that we ink a nuclear deal with Iran and that all of a sudden there will be a flowering of freedom there. That's certainly not the case. But I do think we have to be mindful of those voices as well. And lastly, I would say, and this is something I think, as an American progressive, and just I think most Americans are supportive of these principles generally, is to not make those activists pay the price for an agreement, right? We can sign an agreement with Iran. We have examples in the past where there was an element of détente, but the United States continued to speak in favor of human rights and for democracy, and often very critically. This was part of the U.S. and Soviet détente. We have other examples where we've done this, and I would hope even, I think Donald Trump has never been someone who seems to take human rights very seriously. I know there are voices in Washington who will continue to do that.
Well, that's positive to me compared to some of the other topics we're going to be discussing today, and I hope we can continue these discussions throughout the remainder of the forum. So I just want to thank you all very much for a very lively discussion, and appreciate it. So thank you.
Thank you.